Hello there! Believe it or not, this is actually our last video of the No Talking Read Aloud, and I will be hopefully reading our last two chapters today. So, if you've gotten this far, I hope you enjoyed it, and here we go. The first chapter, or the 19th chapter that we're on, is called Apologies. There were 227 green tile squares on the hallway floor between the cafeteria and the school office. Dave counted each one to keep from thinking about what was going to happen next, but he thought about it anyway. Mrs. Chaplin pointed at the principal's door. "Go right in." Dave knocked. He knew he didn't have to, but it brought him another 2 seconds of delay. Mrs. Hyatt said, "Come in," and Dave thought, excuse me, at least she's not using her bullhorn. He opened the door and she was sitting with her back to him, looking out the windows into the school courtyard. Dave blurted out, "I'm sorry," and he said that because he knew he shouldn't have yelled at the principal, even if he had been right, which he still believed he was. He also apologized because he hoped it might help save his life. So here's the picture of him walking into the principal's office with her standing looking out the window. Mrs. Hyatt turned around and Dave was shocked to see the look on her face, because she wasn't mad. She almost looked like she'd been crying and her nose was pink. She shook her head. "That's why I sent for you, so I could say that. I'm the one who got angry and I yelled first, and I set a terrible example, so I hope you'll forgive me." Dave couldn't remember the last time a grown-up had apologized to him, and to have the principal saying she was sorry, well, he could barely manage a nod at her. She nodded back and then paused and said, "So what are we going to do about this situation?" Not sure," Dave said. She frowned. "Please, you can talk freely in here. None of your friends can hear us." Dave shook his head. "Honor system." Mrs. Hyatt's eyebrows went up. "Oh, of course. Very admirable. Well, maybe you can answer some questions for me just to get started." Dave said, "Sure. First of all, how did all of this get going? Who started it?" Dave smiled. "Mahatma Gandhi." "Pardon me," Mrs. Hyatt said. Dave said, "He stopped talking." The principal said, "And someone wanted to try that here at school, right?" Dave nodded and pointed to himself. "All my fault." "I see," she said. "How did you learn about Gandhi?" He said, "Social studies report." "And why did he stop talking?" Dave shrugged. "To think more." "But you're not keeping silent. Not totally. Why?" Dave thought a moment and then said, "Respect for school," which he knew was going to make him sound like a goody-goody. But it was true. He and his friends weren't trying to shut down the school. Not at all. Mrs. Hyatt nodded slowly and said, "Oh." She seemed to be out of questions, and during that 3 or 4 seconds of silence, an idea jumped into Dave's mind, but he pushed it out. It was too outrageous. But the idea bounced back into his head, and this time Dave just blurted it out. "Want to join?" Mrs. Hyatt bunched her eyebrows together. "What do you mean?" "Join. Stop talking." She looked at Dave as if he had just told her to put on a grass skirt and dance the hula on the roof of a school bus. "Don't be silly. I'm the principal. Do you have any idea how many people I have to speak to every single day?" Dave pointed at a notepad on her desk. "May I?" She nodded and he wrote, "You can only say 3 words in a row, and only if a teacher or a grown-up talks to you first. Except you can talk to a kid first because you're sort of a teacher. And no talking at all outside of school. Honor system. And the whole thing's almost over anyway, just until tomorrow." Then Dave smiled up at her and said, "It's interesting." Mrs. Hyatt shook her head. "I could never." Dave put up his hand like a traffic officer. "There! Stop! 3. Mrs. Hyatt smiled, and it wasn't a principal smile, Dave could tell. She was smiling a real person smile. She smiled because she realized Dave had offered her something important. Just 5 minutes earlier, she had acted like a monster, but she wasn't, not really. Still, she had behaved terribly. Everyone in the cafeteria knew that, kids and grown-ups both. And news like that spreads quickly. So somehow she needed to remind everyone that she wasn't a monster, fast. And Dave had just offered her a way to become human again. Because it's a well-known fact that monsters do not have a sense of humor. She tore Dave's sheet off the notepad, bent over the desk, and did some writing of her own. She stepped quickly into the office and handed Mrs. Chaplin the paper. The secretary read it over quickly and said, "And I should." The principal held up one finger and said, "Type." Then she held up two fingers and said, "Duplicate." And then she held up three fingers and said, "Distribute." And Mrs. Chaplin said, "Got it." Then, turning to Dave, the principal said, "Ready, set, go." Dave's head was spinning, but he managed to say, "Where?" She was already out the office door, and over her shoulders, Mrs. Hyatt said, "To the cafeteria." And the last chapter that we're going to start already is called The Winners. At this point, it might be fun to tell how Dave followed the principal back to the cafeteria and how Mrs. Hyatt apologized to the whole 5th grade by trading 3-word phrases back and forth with Dave, who also apologized. And describing the looks on the faces of all those 5th graders in the cafeteria, not to mention Mrs. Marlowe and the rest of the staff, that might be fun too. Or it might be interesting to tell how Mrs. Hyatt called an all-school assembly 5 minutes later by chiming the school intercom and then saying, "Everyone, auditorium, hurry!" and how all the teachers in every grade were given 5 minutes at the assembly to explain the new no-talking rules to their students, and how loud and confusing it was as they did that, and then how completely quiet it got when the principal announced, "Silence starts now!" And it might be enlightening to explain how Mrs. Hyatt had changed the contest, so that the kids in kindergarten through 4th were competing grade against grade to see who could say the fewest illegal words during the next 23 hours, and why she thought her way was a better idea than boys against girls. And it might be thought-provoking to explain how Dave felt about all this, how he felt that he was sort of like Gandhi, and how Mrs. Hyatt was sort of like the British Empire, and how he felt like there had been a great victory with liberty and justice for all, which included Mrs. Hyatt herself. And Mr. Burton, there's a lot that could be told about him, because he went completely stratospheric. He spent the last 24 hours of the contest scribbling down notes, taking photos, and using a little handheld recorder to capture as many 3-word sentences as possible. He collected so much great material that he began thinking that he could not only write a paper for his human development course, he could practically write a whole book about the way kids and teachers at Laketon Elementary School had changed the way that they expressed themselves, changed their view of language itself, what it is and how it works, and how communication can take so many different forms. And speaking of human development, it might be fun to explore why the very youngest kids could not even imagine how to go without something as amazing and powerful as talking. Not even for 10 minutes, which is why the whole kindergarten was immediately excused from the activity. And how about Thursday morning, when the boys reported 0 honor system word goofs and the girls reported only 1? Telling how Dave and Lindsay reacted to that news would be revealing. And then it would certainly be fun to peek at the challenges Mrs. Hyatt faced as she kept to a strict diet of 3 words at a time. On Wednesday afternoon and again on Thursday morning, she talked with parents, with the superintendent, with the principals of other schools, with the electrician who arrived to repair the milk cooler, and of course with her teachers and with hundreds of kids, all of whom thought it was great to have a principal who just might be a little crazy. In fact, the story could jump a whole week ahead or even months ahead to see the way the 5th graders completed the school year as kinder, more careful talkers and thinkers. Because there's absolutely more to tell. There's always more. But as tempting as it is, it's not the time to tell about all that, because this is the time to jump right to 5th grade lunch on Thursday, right to that point when the original contest was coming to an end, right to that moment of truth when the boys and the girls were getting ready to compare their final scores. Because, with all the goodwill and the happy vibes that swirled out of Mrs. Hyatt's change of heart, plus the excitement of having the whole school go quiet, you might think that somehow the 5th grade boys against girls contest didn't matter anymore, but it did. Remember when Dave stood up and shouted at the principal on Wednesday? Did you think that no one was counting? Not true. Everyone was counting. Dave had said 30 words, grand words, brave and true. However, all 3 of them were illegal. At 12:14, 1 minute before the end of the contest, the cafeteria was silent. Every 5th grader was watching the second hand on the big clock, and so were all the 5th grade teachers. And Mrs. Hyatt, and the custodian, and the school secretary, and the school nurse too. No one wanted to miss this moment in the history of the Unshushables. Dave and Lindsay sat across from each other at the same lunch table, ready for the big tally. Dave dug around in his back pocket and found the crumpled sheet listing all the points against the girls, and Lindsay pulled her little red notebook and a pencil out of her backpack, and she bent over, adding and scribbling away. Glancing down, Dave saw something poking out of the top pouch of Lindsay's backpack. A huge permanent marker, a red one. And Dave had no trouble at all imagining a big L on his forehead, because he already knew the final scores for both teams, and he was sure Lindsay did too. With just 15 seconds to go in the silent cafeteria, Lindsay stood up, looked down at the red notebook, took a deep breath, and she talked. I have to say this, my whole opinion changed. About boys, you really did the honor system great, and being quiet, also great, everyone together, so thanks. And then the second hand pointed straight up, and it was 12:15, and the contest was over. A yell went up that nearly peeled the tiles off the floor. Kids jumped out of their seats and ran and stood, bouncing face to face with groups of friends, and everyone jabbered faster and louder than human beings ever should, laughing and nodding and telling everybody everything they were thinking and feeling. And the louder it got, the louder everyone had to talk to be heard above the rising tumult, and the sound spiraled up toward that point where dogs run and stick their heads under a sofa. And amid the burst of joy and noise and confusion, Lindsay shouted to Dave, "What's the official count?" Dave nodded, cupped his hands around his mouth, and bellowed, 47 against the girls. Lindsay looked at her notebook. She didn't try to talk. It was too loud for that. She turned the notebook around, and at the bottom of the page a number was circled. 74 against the boys, a huge defeat. Lindsay gave him an odd little smile, and Dave was ready for the teasing to begin. She shouted, "You didn't count?" He was confused. "Count what?" "Count?" Lindsay yelled as loud as she could. "What I said, at the end." Dave shook his head. "What?" The sound around them was deafening. Lindsay flipped a page and then turned the red notebook around so Dave could see it. And there was her whole little speech written out word for word. The last word was thanks, and above it she'd written a number, 27. Dave nodded slowly as he stared at the speech and saw what Lindsay had done. He did the math in his head. 7 plus 7 and carry the 1. She had made the contest an exact tie. 74 points for each team. And their private war, to see who got to label the other a loser, also a tie. Her 27 words matched the illegal ones he had yelled at Mrs. Hyatt. Was it all too perfect? Of course it was. Had Lindsay messed with the score against the boys to make it add up that way? Without a doubt. Would there be a big investigation? Not likely. Dave kept looking at his notebook. Lindsay's speech was filled with crossouts and changes. She'd chosen those last words so carefully, making each one count. He wanted to say, "I owe you, big time." He also wanted to say, "I guess I'm pretty much of an idiot, aren't I?" And most of all, he wanted to say what she'd already said, "Thanks." But Dave and Lindsay just sat there grinning at each other in the noisy cafeteria, and neither of them said a thing, not one word. And that is the end of the book. No talking. I love you all very, very much, and I miss you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Hope you enjoyed this. Let me know if you'd like more read-alouds. Bye-bye.